Those of you who are more astute will recognise that I'm not Sheila Coleman. Unfortunately, Sheila has fallen and fractured her wrist, so I've had to make my debut tonight. So go gentle on me, please. It's not quite what I've planned to do, but nonetheless. Len saying who I am. My name is Karie Murphy. I work for Jeremy Corbyn. I used to be Jeremy's chief of staff, and I work in Peace and Justice. So as if you go gentle on me tonight. Now, the event, of course, is to celebrate the poetry book. And for all you know about these two men, and they probably need no introduction, the Daily Mail would describe them as the most hated men in Britain. For those of you who want to believe that, then, you wouldn't be in the room. But if you want a really lovely introduction about who these men are, then please buy the book and read the book, because I wrote the introduction. But it is a pleasure to finally get to the end of the process and putting this poetry book together. So I hope you enjoy it with us tonight as we talk through the reason for the poetry book, the meaning behind it, some of the poems we'll recite, and a kind of narrative to support why the chosen poems are in the book. And believe me, that was a torturous process. There were hundreds and hundreds. But I think the best way just to go through this is section on section, and to ask both Len and Jeremy to describe to us in the first instance how the book came about, and a bit about their own background and how they came to poetry, and how that blended with their own, political views on a whole range of things. So I'm going to start with you, Len.
Okay, thank you, Karie, and good evening, sisters, brothers, comrades and friends. I see so many old friends' faces in the audience, and it's wonderful for me to be back in my beloved city. Never ever lets me down when I come back. We had an incredible rally, Jeremy and I, around about 2:30 for the Palestinian cause. And again, Liverpool people are always on the side of the angels, so thank you for that. This book, incidentally, wouldn't have happened without Karie Murphy. She's the one who's coordinated it, and so a huge thank you to you, Karie. And the proceeds from the book, every penny is going to Peace and Justice. There's about 10 famous individuals who've contributed to it as well, and they are happy to support Peace and Justice. As Karie says, this seed was sown. It was always Karie's idea to do this a couple of years ago, because she knows Jeremy and I don't like poetry, and it just so happens that in this very room on that night was a publisher from New York, Colin Robson, who's here tonight. Where is he? With his dad. And that's fantastic. Although he lives in New York and he's a New York publisher, he's actually from, I was going to say he's a Scouse, but actually he's from the Wirral. He's a lovely man, and he said to Karie, this is a fantastic event, we should do something with it. And so from there grew this. What's it about? Well, it's really about making certain that poetry is extended as far as we can to anyone we can. I grew up in the back streets of Liverpool. Jeremy and I come from slightly different backgrounds, and in my home, which is incredibly loving, and my beautiful older sister Kath is here tonight, there was no poetry books. In fact, when I went to school, there was no poetry. So I wasn't introduced to poetry until later on, because of course poetry, to certainly where I came from, was, for posh people, maybe for some softies. And what we want to do is to say, no, that's not it. Jeremy, in his introduction in the book, talks about there's a poet in all of us, and he's absolutely right in that. Now, I was a child of the 60s, and so it was the protest songs, everything that was going on in the 60s that I lived. A revolution was taking place here in Liverpool. We were the heartbeat of music and what was happening there, but also poetry and culture that was taking place in the pubs, and all of the causes at the time, Vietnam, the American civil rights, the Catholic civil rights movements in Northern Ireland, and of course anti-apartheid. And it was in that arena that protest songs were incredibly important, and the protest songs of Dylan, and in particular, I suppose, Paul Simon, impacted on me dramatically, because it was poetry put to music. I remember Paul Simon did not the best known songs, as called On the Side of the Hill. It was about a cloud weeping over the grave of a little 7-year-old boy who'd been killed in the war. And there's a verse there that has stayed with me all my life. It was, and the war rages on in a land called somewhere, and generals order their men to kill and to fight for a cause they'd long ago forgotten, while a little cloud weeps on the side of a hill. That drew me into poetry, and it was an extraordinary experience. It was like looking over a wall and thinking, wow, and it's guided me all my life. So in a sense, Karie, that's where I got drawn into poetry. And of course, one of our great hopes as we go around the country is to do exactly the same. It'd be lovely for people to be inspired by the book. The book itself was great, difficult for Karie to pull together because Jeremy's got a huge plethora of poetry. Him and I have very little differences in the political arena, and I was in his office one day and his bookshelves were full of poetry, and I said, "Oh, you like poetry?" "Oh, yeah, I love it," he says. "What about you?" I said, "Oh, I love it." And so we used to exchange when we weren't dodging the bullets from the Daily Mail or from the right wing of the Labour Party. Maybe there was more of it. We used to talk about poetry, and that's where it came from. And hopefully, we can talk a bit more as we go on.
Yeah, Jeremy, if you'll just tolerate a couple of minutes, and I think I'll ask Len if he'll recite one of his anti-war poems, given that you reference to it. Len, do you want to give me your favourite anti-war poem?
I will if I can find it. Yeah, it's the poetry, as you know, Jeremy, I don't know, is maybe the most famous campaigner for peace and against war, I would think, in our nation at the moment. And he's this gentleman that gets attacked for trying to tell people that having war and conflict is not the best way to resolve situations. First World War poets were incredible because no TV, and these poets effectively were in the trenches. Lots of fabulous poems, some quite jingoistic and pro-war and pro the establishment and the empire. Others very anti-war, and for me, maybe the greatest of that was Wilfred Owen. He, as you know, they were in the trenches, and Wilfred Owen was killed 1 week before armistice. He was 25 years of age, and for me it symbolised the wasted young lives, the millions of young men and women that were sent to their death by the bureaucrats throughout Europe. For me, if not the best, certainly one of the best anti-war poems. It's called Dulce et decorum est, and it's Latin, and its Latin translation is, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. Just think about that. It is sweet and proper to die for one's country. That is actually etched on the wall in Sandhurst Military Academy. Young men and women going to be trained are told that. It's why Wilfred Owen called it the old lie, and this is it. Bent double like beggars under sacks, knock-kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge, till on the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge. Men marched asleep, many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshot, all went lame, all blind, drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind. Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time. But someone still was yelling out and stumbling and floundering like a man in fire or lime, dimmed through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green sea I saw him drowning. In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning. If in some smothering dreams you too could pace behind the wagon that we flung him in, and watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin. If you could hear at every jolt the blood come gurgling from the froth-corrupted lungs, obscene as cancer, bitter as the crud of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues. My friend, you would not tell with such high zest to children ardent for some desperate glory the old lie, dulce et decorum est pro patrimonium.
Jeremy, over to you. Would you like to tell us a bit about your background, particularly influences when you were younger, and how those influences manifested in later life to refine you as probably the most recognised street protester?
Thanks, Karie. Thank you all for being here tonight. I want to say a huge thank you to Karie for inspiring us on this book, Progress Chasing When We Were Slow. Sometimes congratulate us when we arrived on time to something.
That never happened.
Which we would have done if we hadn't.
Yeah.
I grew up in Shropshire, 60 miles or so south of Liverpool. Not that far away in reality, but a world away in other ways. And I did get poetry at school. My primary school teacher used to read us a poem every Monday morning, which was lovely. My secondary school was a grammar school that wanted to be a public school but wasn't, and they were very upset about that. And I was very upset about being there anyway. And so, you know, we had differences, shall we say, a lot of them. And we were given an awful lot of incredibly imperial-minded nationalist poetry. We were told it was good for us. So we got a lot of Tennyson and a lot of John Masefield and things like that. We didn't get so much of the First World War poets or anything else like that. And so I have always been inspired by poetry. My mum was a great admirer of Shelley, and she said, you can read Shelley 1,000 times and you learn from it every time. And she's dead right. And if any of you really want to take on Shelley in a good way, I advise reading Paul Foot's book about Red Shelley, which is the incredible inspiration he had. He was a very complicated character. And if you really want to entertain yourself, there's a book called 1815, A Summer with L.B. And it was Shelley, Lord Byron, and Mary Shelley going, fueled by a lot of drugs and a lot of alcohol, across Europe to spend a summer in Geneva. And Byron had a bit of money at that time, but was running out of it. And so they rented a house across the lake in Geneva. And they were so raucous and so noisy, the town complained about the noise coming from a house across the lake. So it must have been, and this was without sound system.
Wonderful.
It sounds great. I mean, I think you were probably there, Len. And anyway, Byron and Shelley sort of spent a lot of time chatting to each other, taking more and more exotic and expensive drugs and getting into very strange places and writing very strange things. Mary Shelley was then 16 and was eloping with Percy Shelley, and her dad, William Godwin, didn't really approve of this, and he chased after them but couldn't get a boat across the channel to catch them. And then she thought this pair of these pair of wastrels are just wasting their time away. So she said, sod you, went off to another room in this very large house, sat down and wrote Frankenstein at 16. Amazing. And so the book is very funny, but also very intuitive. And what I find amazing about Shelley is the sense of imagination he had for somebody who had grown up in a sort of moderately privileged, complicated life, who was endlessly trying to get money off his dad, who was a member of parliament but didn't approve his politics. So he kept saying to him, I'll give you some money if you stop writing revolutionary poetry. Shelley chose the revolutionary poetry, not the money. Thank God for that. And his book, which we'll come to later on, his great poem, Masque of Anarchy, is something we've often looked at. So I just want to say, young people write poetry. When we were here last time at the Casa, there were some people asked to read their own poetry on their mobile phones, which was absolutely great. And that was the inspiration behind this book, is to try and make poetry popular. And say to anyone who writes poetry, good on you, don't be embarrassed, read it out. And the last thing I'll say is this, I really hope everybody really enjoys this book. It's been one of the greatest pleasures of my life putting this book together. And we're not done yet. I want to do another one called Poetry from the Many. The poem I'm going to read now is, to follow the points that Len made, is called Dead Man's Dump. And Dead Man's Dump is by Isaac Rosenberg, who was a young Jewish man, grew up in Whitechapel, quite troubled, artistic, poetic, poor. And Whitechapel was a melting pot of refugees and migrants. He was Jewish, and his family, I would imagine, came from Germany or Russia, not quite sure. And Chris Searle has written some lovely books about his life. Chris Searle, who wrote Stepney Words. And Isaac was very worried about life, obviously worried about the war. And he's written this in the First World War, and joined the army as a volunteer because he wanted to send money home to his mum. He wasn't that committed to the war or anything like that. And he got a terrible position in the war, which was to go onto the battlefield with a mule and cart. When the guns were silent, after they'd gone over the top and it had been unsuccessful, you know, they advanced 50 yards, then retreated 25 yards, and so on and so on. And thousands would died on the way. His job was to go out with a team of people with this mule and cart to pick up the bodies of those that had died, or if they found anyone that still had any breath in them, to put them on the cart and bring them back. I mean, horrendous position to have to be in. So I'm going to read the last few verses of it. And if you don't mind, I'd like you to think of yourselves now, as I'm reading it, as being on the Western Front, ahead of the trenches and the barbed wire, with this cart, and there's dead bodies and groaning men all around. Your job is to try to save life. Manic earth, howling and flying your bowel, seared by the jagged fire, the iron love, the impetuous storm of savage love. Dark earth, dark heavens, swinging in chemic smoke. What dead are born when you kiss each soundless soul, with lightning and thunder from your mind heart, which man's self dug and his blind fingers loosed. A man's brain splattered on a stretcher bearer's face. His shook shoulders slipped their load. When they bent to look again, the drowning soul was sunk too deep for human tenderness. They left this dead with the older dead stretched at the crossroads. Burnt black by strange decay, their sinister faces lie, the lid over each eye. The grass and coloured clay, more motion have than they, joined to the great sunk silences. Here is one not long dead, his dark hearing caught our far wheels, and the choked soul stretched weak hands to reach the living word the far wheels said. The blood-dazed intelligence beating for light, crying through the suspense of the far torturing wheels, swift for the end to break. or the wheels to break, cried as the tide of the world broke over his sight. Will they come? Will they ever come? Even as the mixed hooves of the mules, the quivering bellied mules, and the rushing wheels all mixed with his tortured, upturned sight. So we crashed round the bend. We heard his weak scream. We heard his very last sound, and our wheels raised his dead face.
Thanks, Jeremy. I think both of those anti-war poems are really, they're quite shocking really in the content, disturbing to read with what beautifully written poems there are. I would like to move on to something just a wee bit lighter. I've just actually seen poetry on a t-shirt. A young woman has just walked through the door there with "Still Hate Thatcher." That's yeah, and I can just imagine the new headlines: Corbyn, sex, drugs, and Frankenstein. I think it would be remiss of us not to allow you to recite one of your poems line. Yeah, so, well, what one would you like to? You're a bit of a romantic, so you choose the one you feel right. A road not taken. If you want to take the road not taken, we'll take that as a love poem.
Okay, if you want
Your
to.
journey in.
Yeah, I will do. Because, I think I've got about 5 poems in here, but I haven't got them marked. I think it's the romantic in here. I think just following the theme, because the interesting thing about this book is it's not just poetry that we like, it's why we've chosen this one, how did we get to it, what impact did it have. And again, just following the theme when I was young and liked Paul Simon. Paul Simon had a song called Dangling Conversation. And there was a line in that said, and you read your Emily Dickinson, and I my Robert Frost, and we note our place with bookmarkers and measure what we've lost. And that brought me into the poetry of Emily Dickinson. Beautiful. I've got one of her poems in here. And Robert Frost. And so the poem I'm going to read is Robert Frost's The Road Not Taken. Because I love the poem, and then when I read it, Jeffrey was making the point you could read, Jeremy was making the point that you could read poetry and understand the meaning better. And this, to me, not only kind of describes my life in a way, but I suspect everybody's life. It's about when you have to make decisions and you decide to go this way as opposed to that way. What would have happened? So, The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. 2 roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both. And be one traveller, long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Then took the other as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim, because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as far as that passing there had warned them both really about the same. And both that morning equally lay, in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'm sure you all feel you know a lot about Jeremy, and of course you do know quite a lot. He's very often described as that jam-making bastard and so on and so forth. At his heart is a genuinely gentle, kind and loving man. And in particular when it comes to Laura Alvarez, who's already been mentioned tonight. She's at the back somewhere, I'm sure, Laura. No, she's at the bar.
Still waiting. Get right from the bar. Get her to come in.
She's gone. But Laura's from Mexico, and Jeremy and Laura married in Mexico. So he has a poem in the book which I would love you to read, Jeremy. Just give us a bit of a description as to why you've agreed to have this poem in the book.
This poem is called You Foolish Men by Juana Inés de la Cruz. I would imagine, until you saw this book, very few of you would have heard of her. She was a Mexican woman, a daughter of a Spanish colonel and a Aztec woman. It was not a loving relationship, I suspect. We're not sure, but she was the product of what she would be called illegitimate, which I think is a horrible term to use, but nevertheless, that's the way she was described at that time. And she was brought up partly on her grandfather's hacienda, because they had to put her somewhere. She was sort of hidden away a bit there, and then put into a convent at the Hacienda La Panoya, which is a convent place about 2 hours away from Mexico. And there she came into her own, in a sense. She was a very intelligent woman. She managed to learn her own language, Nahuatl, as well as Spanish and Latin, taught herself all of this, and wrote extensively about the rights of women and the way that the church at that time was oppressing those rights of women and the way the society was oppressing the rights of women, particularly non-Spanish women in Mexico. And this didn't go down very well with the powers that be, as you would imagine. And so she was told to stop writing. She refused, so she carried on writing. So they destroyed some of her works and eventually threw her out of the convent. So we don't want you here anymore. And then she lived in poverty after that, looking after people who were victims of plagues and things, and eventually died from a plague that she contracted while she was there. And she lived from 1651 to 1695. And she wrote this amazing work more than 100 years before Mary Wollstonecraft wrote a treatise on the rights of women. And Laura and I have got a special feeling about this place. We got married at the Hacienda La Panoya in front of the volcano where Sir Juana had been. And her work has now been, what's survived has been published by Octavio Paz in Mexico. And we want to give it as much publicity as we can, because I think it's an amazing story of the indomitable spirit of a woman who was oppressed by everyone around her, but nevertheless has left us this great legacy. It's quite a long poem, and Karie won't be pleased if I say read all of it, will you?
No, Jeremy, you can read the last one. I've got 46 verses, you'll be glad that maybe everyone.
Okay, so you'll obviously have to read the whole of it when you get the book and get a chance to read it. And so I'll read the last few verses of it, which give you a flavour of the wit. And it's actually very funny in places, but it's a biting wit that has meaning behind it. That's sometimes the best wit. And I read this last part. But with the anger and the grief that your pleasure tells, good luck to her who doesn't love you. And you go on and complain. Your lover's moans give wings to women's liberty, and having made them bad, you want to find them good. Who's embraced the greater plain in pain? She who solicited falls, or he who fallen pleads? Who is more to blame, though either should do wrong? She who sins for pay, or he who pays for sin? Why be outraged at the guilt that is of your own doing? Have them as you make them, or make them what you will. Leave off your wooing, and then with greater cause you can blame the passion of her who comes to court. Patent is your arrogance that fights with many weapons, since in promise and insistence you join world, flesh, and devil.
So I've got this script in front of me, which of course was written for Sheila, who's not here tonight, and it says on it, poems from Karie, and I absolutely refuse to be doing 2 jobs. However, when we went to the Edinburgh Festival, we met a young Scottish poet called Hannah Lavery, and we have actually, one of her poems is in the book, but the one that we love the best is quite naughty because there's a few sweary words in it. So rather than have myself or Len or Jeremy blacken our character, we've got Big Carol down from Scotland and Great Friend, in fact my best friend from Scotland, and Carol's going to read. And the poem is on the context of some racism in society in Scotland, and this is a poem that reflects the views of a young immigrant who's a bit annoyed here. If you have any sensitivities about bad language, I suggest you leave the room now. And look away. Yeah, or look away. Thanks, Karen.
Scotland, you're no mine. You were no his, and I don't want you. So go ahead, say I don't belong, with your sepia-tinged cross-eye sweeping over all that swept away, blood-stained, sweat-stained sugar for your tablet. Ya macaroon, ya rotten, gobby, greedy, thieving bastard you. Sitting atop all that shite and broken bones, weeping, for me. Fuck you. I will dance jigs on your flags, blue, white, and red. It doesn't matter, but ya wee chancer. Fuck for making us complicit, handing us whips and chains, an officer's coat, a civil service pen, a queen to love. And lay me out. I love you with your mountain time and all your coorie in. And you can say, I dinna belong to you. Go on. But I am limp, it's stuck on you. So fuck you for no seeing one of your own. I will spill here, my blood and your secrets. Bleed into you, root and earth. And you, forever pagan, will, in the spill and the seep, see all you really are. So fuck you, my sweet forgetful Caledonia, with love, fuck you.
I love it when we've been going around the country, because that's one of Jeremy's choices, when he reads it out. So here you've got this gentleman, effing and blind. Fantastic.
It's the only time ever.
Thanks, Carol. Can we turn now to, I mean, we're both recognised as being trade unionists and internationalists, so can we turn now to some of your international influences and the choices that, the poetry choices that you made that kind of reflect some of your politics? Len, one of the poems that you picked was Invictus. Do you want to do Invictus?
Yeah. Yes, colleagues. As I indicated before, the child of the 60s with lots going on, and I found myself being dragged not only into poetry but into politics. So the question of international solidarity is absolutely essential for a better world when people are in struggle. It's fantastic for them to know that there's millions of people around the world with them in that struggle. I've been involved in the Chile Solidarity campaign since 1973, when Salvador Allende, a democratically elected president, was overthrown by the American CIA. The Cuba Solidarity campaign, this beautiful, beautiful island of just 11 million people who are apparently this terrible, evil axis and danger to the United States. Of course, the fight for the Palestinian Solidarity campaign, which I've been a member of all my life virtually, and that is more important than ever now. But the one thing that kind of was loomed large throughout my younger life was the anti-apartheid movement. And I was a shop steward on the Liverpool docks, and we used to get up to all kinds of things in support of the anti-apartheid movement, which I was a member of. A lot of it was illegal. I'm advised by my solicitors not to go too much into detail on that, because I could still be pulled in. But it was great to make certain that any military equipment going to the South American government was found to not work when it got there, or the produce that came either way. And of course, the one man who loomed so large, who can ever forget the the Wembley rock concerts for his birthday. And, you know, Simple Minds as Mandela Day and Free Nelson Mandela, which echoed around the world. And this incredible man, I should just make a quick comment here. Margaret Thatcher, who she regarded Mandela as the #1 terrorist in the world. That says a lot about her grief. Had there been an election for a world leader, he would have won by a landslide. Imprisoned in Robben Island for 27 years, he memorised a poem, his favourite poem. It was a poem written by a Victorian poet, William Ernest Henley, back in the 1800s, and it's called Invictus. And when I read this, made me very emotional thinking about this great man, and it's a lovely poem. Out of the night that covers me, black is the pit from pole to pole. I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. In the fell clutch of circumstance, I've not winced nor cried aloud. Under the bludgeonings of chance, my head is bloody but unbowed. Beyond this place of wrath and tears looms but the horror of the shade, and yet the menace of the years finds and shall find me unafraid. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul.
I think it would be remiss of us not to turn our thoughts to Gaza, as painful and as horrific as it is to do so. But it does certainly focus people's minds when you take somebody like Corbyn, who has campaigned for the Palestinian people all his life, and you look back to 15 and 16 and 17, all the attacks on Jeremy and his leadership, and the wild allegations about racism and anti-Semitism, when of course now it's very, very clear that what this is actually about is Jeremy's foreign policy and his beliefs in relation to freedom in Palestine. Before what has happened in Gaza currently, the book was finished and the poem was in. And I think it's to your credit, Jeremy, that you've never ever abandoned your beliefs about Palestine. And it's fantastic that there is a poem about Palestine in the book. So I do think you should read that one, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks, Karie. What's happening in Gaza is unbelievable. We're watching in real time on television the destruction of a whole life, buildings, homes, schools, hospitals, everything. And our government cannot even bring itself to call for a ceasefire. And so many of our political leaders are capable of doing that as well. I have spent a lot of time campaigning for the rights and justice of the Palestinian people. I've been 9 times to Palestine and to Israel and to Gaza, and Palestine in terms of the West Bank. The poem I've included in the book is called In Jerusalem by Mahmoud Darwish. Mahmoud Darwish died in 2008, so he hasn't seen the horrors of the latest stuff. And he grew up in a village that was then occupied by Israel in the formation of Israel. He was then went to live in Lebanon, was driven into Lebanon, then went back and grew up in Israel, and then went away from Israel to Russia. He joined the Communist Party in Israel, and he wrote in Hebrew and in Arabic and in French. And so he was very much a polymath in so many ways. And he was then banned because he had joined the PLO and supported the liberation of Palestine, then banned from ever going back to Jerusalem or ever going back to the West Bank. So he lived and died in exile. And this poem was written in 1974, which is 7 years after the Six-Day War. And it's in slight terms a flight of the mind about Jerusalem as the place that Palestinians revere and believe to be their capital, and they're right, and it is a wonderful city. And so I just read part of this wonderful poem called In Jerusalem by Mahmoud Darwish. Read it all, thank you. In Jerusalem, and I mean within the ancient walls, I walk from one epoch to another without a memory to guide me. The prophets over there are sharing the history of the holy ascending to heaven and returning less discouraged and melancholy, because love and peace are holy and are coming to town. I was walking down a slope and thinking to myself, how do the narrators disagree over what light said about a stone? Is it from a dimly lit stone that wars flare up? I walk in my sleep. I stare in my sleep. I see no one behind me. I see no one ahead of me. All this light is for me. I walk. I become lighter. I fly. Then I become another, transfigured. Words spout like grass from Isaiah's messenger's mouth. If you don't believe, you won't be safe. I walk as if I were another, and my wound a white biblical rose, and my hands like two doves on the cross hovering and carrying the earth. I don't walk, I fly. I become another, transfigured. No place and no time. So who am I? I am number one in the ascension's presence. But I think to myself, alone, the Prophet Muhammad spoke classical Arabic. And then what? Then what? A woman soldier shouted. Is that you again? Didn't I kill you? I said, yes. You killed me. And I forgot, like you, to die.
I think we're also on the international theme. We might just steam off it for two reasons. Firstly, I know there's a poem that Len particularly likes, which I think we can squeeze in looking at time. And also, like Enter Secret, Jeremy Corbyn writes some poetry. It's actually one of his, in fact, his only published poem in the book, but we'll let him catch his breath because I'm going to introduce that, Jeremy, in just a couple of minutes. And maybe you can remember to introduce your anecdote about your crushing blow in Said magazine. But back to you, Len, if you want to. I know you're very inspired by Jack Jones in the Spanish Civil War, so would you like to do then international?
Oh yeah, sure, I will. Is it on? Yeah. Yeah, obviously internationalism is extremely important to all of us, and of course, very often brave men and women do incredible things, often at risk of losing their lives, and of course, many do lose their lives. And the Spanish Civil War was one of those occasions. My son Ian, who's here tonight, bought me a book on Spain, the Civil War, written by the participants themselves, people who you won't know. But of course, the Spanish Civil War, one of my great heroes, Jack Jones, from this wonderful city, and who became General Secretary of the TNG, was a member of the International Brigade. These incredibly brave people who came from all over to defend democracy in Spain. Jack was wounded at the Battle of Ebro and fortunately didn't die. And it was an incredible act of selflessness by all of the brigaders. When I was General Secretary of the of Unite, I was able to speak on a number of occasions at the annual International Brigade Memorial Trust, and it's important to keep these issues alive. When the brigaders came home to Britain, they were met in London by a big crowd and a huge banner with one of Lord Byron's great quotes, which said, "Yet freedom, yet thy banner torn but framed, streams like the thunderstorm against the wind." Absolutely wonderful. But the poem I want to read is by a man by the name of Clive Branson, who unfortunately died in the Second World War. Some of his poetry has lived on and in fact has found its way into the Tate Gallery in London. But this is what he wrote, and it's called The International. We'd left our training base, and by the time night fell, stood facing the universe, singing The International. I remember it so well, waiting in the station yard. The darkness stood around still, and the stars, masses, stirred. That's when I first understood one is never alone in this fight. I thought the goodbye was for good and left all behind that night. For everything new that I meet, no matter how strange and uncertain, holds something familiar that proves the fight is still on. How often I've marched, and marching I sang of an England unseen, watched the great crowds gathering and the tramp of their feet beat in tune. Even in the grip of prison, I joined in the singing of millions as they wait at their wayside station that leads to the battle lines. I'm singing in every country where I tread through the streets of time. One man, one woman, humanity, the International, our theme.
I'd like to now read the last poem in the book. It's called Calais in Winter, which I wrote. I've been to Calais many times in my life, and more recently in the last few years, to visit the camps, the jungle, and meet the refugees that are there. And if anyone sort of in a future century or 20 years' time looks back on the media during this period, they say, well, what is this absurd obsession about a relatively small number of people risking all to cross the channel to try and get to a place of safety? Nobody willingly risks all to get in a dinghy that you wouldn't have on a park lake, unless you're totally desperate.
Yeah,
And that's what they are.
absolutely.
They're not enemies, they're people who are victims of war,
Yeah.
human rights abuse, poverty, environmental destruction. And I've been there quite a few times. And when I came back from one visit, I just felt so angry about it. I wrote this poem on the way back. And I wasn't going to publish it, but Karie persuaded me I should, because it's the first poem I've ever had published. Now, I did make an attempt at getting poetry published in 1968. And I was so traumatised by the unsuccessful experience, I didn't publish anything until 2023. So I've got over it now. I'm okay. I'm all right about it. I wrote a poem which was about what happened in 1968, the uprising in Paris, and the appalling treatment of Nelson Mandela and others by the apartheid system in South Africa. They were not household names at that time at all. This was post-Rivonia treason trial. They were non-people. So I wrote this. So I wrote a poem saying, I'll just give you the first two lines of it. Today, the flood tide of human advance started with the burning of the gold exchange in South Africa and the lifting the cobblestones in Paris. And that was how it started, and I'll find the rest of it and let you have it. I sent it to the New Statesman, thinking, good poem, this thing. Found it. First up for a young girl. I'm there. A month later, they sent me a printed postcard back saying, not accepted. So I've had a down with the New Statesman ever since. I'm not going to give it to them, I'm going to give it to some much more worthwhile publication in the future. Anyway, so the poem is my anger at what I saw, and I hope you'll bear with me while I read it. Cold, wet marshlands surround Calais in winter. Police take tents away from the homeless. The railway station is protected with razor wire. Motorways have walls on each side. Trees are cut down to create open land. Huge rocks prevent anyone leaving a road. There is fear in Calais. It stalks every official building. It seeps into the minds of the police. It pervades all thinking. It gives imagination to cold-hearted people to confront the enemy. When they escape to the sea in flimsy boats that would be at home on a small lake, they have to be stopped, with bayonets puncturing them, clothing taken that would protect against the cold. The enemy comes on foot, in lorries and buses with few clothes, no money, no food, few friends, only memories of bombardment and war, of families in jail, of crops destroyed, of empty schools, of floods and drought, of bitter travelling in secret lorries on mountain paths, in safe houses of razor wire and cameras hidden in trees. Volunteers in a big store, handing clothing and boots, backpacks and sleeping bags, gloves and socks, wood for fires, medicines too, huge vats of cooking rice, aromatic curries, wholesome bread, fresh fruit, clean water in big vats for the thirsty, delivered around the town to enemy groups who changed location every day, whilst harassed by police, shunned and abused by those with a cold heart, except in one place in the centre of town, with warmth and food and power for a few hours to be secure. In the beauty of the sunset, in cold winter time, the setting sun gleams on the Hotel de Ville. A crowd gathers around a white van to eat what has come and search for a place to rest. They will be stopped, thunder politicians. The enemy will not land, say screaming headlines. They're lawbreakers, say experts on the radio. Their homes are a long list of places in fire, where wars are fought and minerals abound, where money is made and people disappear. Calais in winter is cold and hard. Calais in summer is busy and happy, but hot and tense for the enemy.
There's a poem by James Oppenheim, which is written at the turn of the last century, 1911, called Bread and Roses. And Bread and Roses is a wonderful slogan. It's a slogan that is well known throughout the world amongst radical comrades. And it's so simple in its message. It says, yes, we want bread in order to survive. We have to live. But we're not just units of production. We want roses too. We want to enjoy the good things in life. And back in the beginning of the last century, it was an American feminist by the name of Helen Todd who coined the phrase bread and roses. It became the slogan of the suffragettes movement. It also became the slogan of one of the most important strikes in American history, and indeed in world history, which took place in 1912 in Lawrence, Massachusetts, when hundreds of thousands of textile workers, mainly women, came out on strike and were on strike during a bitter cold winter for a number of months, during which time they were attacked by the police and battened women and children, which caused outrage across the states. It was known as the Bread and Roses strike, and it was successful. The union, the International Workers of the World, gained massive increases in pay and conditions. And it was so powerful a message that literally hundreds of thousands of other women textile workers in New England were all given the same pay rise by their employers, who were afraid that the union would call a similar strike in their own company. Some 80 years later, I was involved in another famous Bread and Roses strike. The SEIU is the largest union in America, and they were involved in a massive strike for mainly Latino women who were cleaners, janitors in in LA, and they were also attacked on a demonstration by the police, batons, women and children, as a result of which more outrage, and they achieved victory. Ken Loach did a film called Bread and Roses. You should take the chance to do it. But this poem brilliantly captures what it was all about. As we come marching, marching in the beauty of the day, 1,000,000 darkened kitchens, 1,000 mill lofts grey, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses, for the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses. As we come marching, marching, we battle too for men, for they are women's children, and we mother them again. Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we come marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing their ancient song of bread. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits new. Yes, bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we come marching, marching, we bring the great days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler, 10 that were the one, 10 that were one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Yeah, there's so many poems that I really enjoy, and the sadness about this book is that so many poems that are not in it, because there's so many wonderful poems that we'd like to add, but maybe that's for another time. I want to quote part of A Far Cry from Africa by Derek Walcott. Derek Walcott was a Caribbean poet who grew up in St. Lucia, died in 2017, divided his time between St. Lucia, London a bit, in the USA, and where he finally died. And he was part of a generation of poets of the post-Second World War period in the Caribbean that were trying to cast off the imposed culture of colonialism that ruled the Caribbean at that time. At the same time, there were many poets and others in Africa trying to cast off the European culture that had been imposed on them during the colonial period. So he was always searching for a development of an Afro-Caribbean culture and poetry, and wrote extensively and quite amazing works on it. And I was very inspired by it. And I first came across him when I had the amazing fortune of spending 2 years in Jamaica in the 1960s, and that taught me a great deal about the history of it and the way in which they were trying to bring to life the reality of the effects of the slave trade, which were of course being ignored in history everywhere, including here. And so he wrote a poem about Kenya, because Kenya achieved its independence in 1962, but in the 1950s there was the uprising, the Mamo uprising, essentially the Kikuyu people against the colonial occupation of Kenya. And they were accused of the most appalling brutality. The most appalling brutality was meted out against the Mamo by the British Army, including beatings, torture, concentration camps, and castration of people. And it was only years later the campaign for justice for the Mamo people got going, and I remember accompanying some of the survivors of this, Mamo people, to the High Court, where they pleaded their case for compensation and justice for the way they'd been treated. And there was something quite poignant about it. They're sitting there in the court, this group of much older Kenyan people, all of whom been brutally treated and grotesquely disfigured as a result of the way they were treated by the British Army, I have to say, standing there in court trying to explain to an ever so upper class and ever so proper judge what went on there. And it was, you could have heard a pin drop as they described how they were beaten and tortured. And Derek Walcott wrote a poem about this, and in this poem he describes some of the treatment. I'll just read part of it. This is the army in operation. Threshed out by beaters, the long rushes break in white dust of ibises, whose cries have wheeled since civilization's dawn. From the parched river or beast-steaming plain, the violence of beast on beast is read as natural law. But upright man seeks his divinity by inflicting pain. Delirious as those worried beasts, his wars dance to the tightened carcass of a drum, while he calls courage still that natives dread, or that white peace contracted by the dead. Again brutish necessity wipes his hands upon the napkin of a dirty cause, again a waste of our companion. As with Spain, the guerrilla wrestles with the superman. I who am poisoned with the blood of both, where shall I turn divided to the vein? I who have cursed the drunken officer of British rule, how choose between this Africa and the English tongue I love? Betray them both, give back what they give. How can I face such slaughter and be cool? How can I turn from Africa and live?
Can I just make a very quick comment about Shelley? You know, a decent man who's been attacked in the most, is this on?
Yeah.
In the most despicable way. And yet, you know, there isn't an ounce of malice in him. It's quite extraordinary. I have to say, you can't say the same about me. I've got a little black book and there's a number of bastards that I'd like to do this. Well, let me just give this last one. Liverpool, of course, has got a very strong Irish influence in it from the thousands, the hundreds of thousands who were forced to leave that beautiful island. What's less known is that there is a strong Welsh influence within Liverpool. Thousands of Welsh builders came to Liverpool and built many of the terraced houses in certain parts of the city. Where my mum and dad lived in Walton, for example. A Welsh builder by the name of Owen Ellis and his son William. Actually in Walton, there's a row of streets, terraced streets, which bear the first name, the first letter of their name. So for Owen, there's Oxton, Winslow, Eton, and Neston. And for his son William, Wilburn, Ismay, Lind, Lowell, Index, Arnott, and Monty, all next to one another. Wales has always been very special for me. It kind of, my misspent youth was in North Wales, in the caravan sites and the camping sites of Brill and Town and Preston. Absolutely. And we won't go any deeper into that. And of course, I also love the Welsh lilt, fabulous orators, and none more so than Dylan Thomas. I once heard Richard Burton, another fantastic orator, recite on radio Under Milk Wood. It was just wonderful. And Dylan's words were, of course, wonderful. I have to confess that the only way I can read Under Milk Wood is when I'm alone in a room and I read it out loud in a Welsh accent. The only way it worked for me. Of course, Dylan was an alcoholic. He was doomed not to live very long, and he died in New York, where our publisher, Corbyn, now resides. There was another reason why I read this poem at one of our recitals, and it was effectively a message to Jeremy Corbyn. Do not go gentle into that good night. It was at a time when, quite disgraceful, Keir Starmer had withdrawn the Labour whip from him, denying him the right to run as a Labour MP in his constituency, Islington North, where he's been the MP for 40 years. And it was a kind of subliminal message from me to Jeremy: do not go gentle into that good night. I'm pleased to report that he's taken that on board. And I hope Jeremy Gordon will be the MP for Islington North for many years to come. I'm trying to persuade my eldest son Ian to recite at my funeral when the time comes. Do not go gently into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Though wise men at their end know dark is right, because their words had fought no lightning, they do not go gentle into that good night. Good men, the last wave by, crying how bright their frail deeds might have danced in a green bay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Wild men, who caught and sang the sun in flight and learned too late they grieved it on its way, do not go gentle into that good night. Grave men near death, who see with blinding sight, blind eyes could blaze like meteors and be gay. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. And you, my Father, there on the sad height, curse, bless me now with your fierce tears, I pray. Do not go gentle into that good night. Rage, rage against the dying of the light.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this evening. It was nice for some time. I hope you saw a slightly different side to what you would normally see with Len and Jeremy. People do appreciate it. I hope you did. Jamie's going to finish off with a song, but just in a minute, Jamie, if you just bear with me. I've got a couple of things I wanted to say before we wrap up. The book, as I said earlier, it's obviously raising money for peace and justice, but I wanted to read out the dedication inside. This book is dedicated to all suffering from miscarriages of justice. In particular, we extend our solidarity to Julian Assange.
Yeah, in 1819, there was a massacre that took place in Manchester at Peterloo. Hundreds of thousands of ordinary people like us had gathered to hear speakers talk about a greater voice for working people. It's regarded in history as the first step towards the democracy that we currently have today. The establishment sent in the cavalry with sabres and cut to pieces men, women and children. Many died, hundreds were injured. Some 200 years later, great director Mike Leigh did a film, Peterloo. Great film if you haven't seen it. It stars my favourite actor, Maxine Peake, who's also got a poem in this book. But back in 1819, when Shelley heard of the outrage, he wrote his masterpiece, A Masque of Anarchy. Please take the opportunity, if you do nothing else, take time to read The Masque of Anarchy. It's a very, very long poem, but it is as relevant today as it was 200 years ago. And it's the last three verses that Jeremy and I believe capture the spirit of The Masque of Anarchy.
And that slaughter to the nation shall steam up like inspiration, eloquent, oracular, a volcano heard afar.
And these words shall then become like oppression's thundered doom, ringing through each heart and brain, heard again, again, again,
Rise like lions after slumber, in unvanquishable number. Shake your chains to earth like dew, which in sleep had fallen on you. Ye are many, they are few.